We can perhaps see the ego as a representation of the shadow within our collective, the shadow within the consensus reality that we're existing within. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Going Dotty. I'm Trace Egan, and in today's video we want to look at some of the solutions that we can offer to dealing with the ego in others. So let's get into that. When we're dealing with toxic individuals, egos and stuff like that in other people, it can be really difficult to find a grounding cord to come back to, something that you can rely on, a reasonable foundational thought that allows you to accept, cope and deal with what's going on. So, in the last video on the kind of summary of ego, we spoke about, being aware and trying to offer a little bit of gratitude for the awareness that if an ego comes up in your life and in your world, that means that it's something that has now come up, your time is up, your card is on the table, and it's time for you to be developing, growing within yourself. So I do recommend that you go watch that video to flesh out that point a little bit more. But something similar that we can suggest about the ego is that the ego is a mental body construct just trying to survive. It's very tempting to lose our power and our individuality and our sense of self to a larger situation like a toxic dynamic or relationship with somebody else. But one of the truths that I think we can take from their experience and reality is that this is their mental health system in operation. This is them trying to do the very same thing that we are trying to do when we're working on our personal development. We just want to live in our life. We want to be, happy, joyful, functioning, these sorts of things. And so does the ego. But the ego doesn't know how to do this. The ego really is disconnected from the chi of life, the natural forces of time. And yes, the person who lives in an egoic mentality is responsible for themselves. But I think we can really look at the larger social construct as well. How is an ego formed? Well, conditioning, training, and a large amount of that conditioning comes from the society. If you grow up in an environment where this is the way people are, this is the way you might tend to be. And how responsible are you as an individual for that? Now, you're accountable for doing the best that you can within that when it becomes highlighted for you. If a loved one goes to an ego or toxic person and says, you're too difficult for me to deal with, then it's that toxic person's choice of, whether they will deal or engage with that or not. But I think there should also be some semblance of understanding in a larger general context, not necessarily like the individual, because the difficulty with the ego is once you get into the nitty-gritty of the egoic individual, it can become like an inner war where you're trying to empower yourself because you're right and they're wrong, and they don't even realize that this is going on. It can be very difficult. But in a larger general sense, I think that the ego is, to a large extent, has been a creation of just our modern times and choices that humanity has been making for a couple of generations now. And whether we've been actively making those choices or whether we've been passively going along with decisions made for us by larger things, media, corporations, businesses, entertainment, by consumerism, or governments or the supporting bodies of governments. All of these large industries and organizations have a vested interest in people only thinking a certain way. That's understandable, but is that system working? And for somebody who comes up into this system and moves throughout that system, it's this grey area of how individually responsible can somebody be for something that they're not conscious of. Because the ego is a very unconscious individual. Now, they still have access to their consciousness, but they're also tapped out of the system. And when they're tapped out, they can't be in it. And when you're not in it, you can't access. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. It's difficult for you when you're dealing with toxic people, but it's difficult for toxic people to get out of being toxic. So a little bit of an understanding or a preliminary awareness of this really helps when we're just trying to come into balance, harmony and homeostasis with the situation that's going on. I also think that there's a lot of validity in the concept that the ego is consciousness in development. You know, if we look at this whole situation as our conscious construct and levels of consciousness, states of consciousness, you know, shallow, superficial consciousness, or steady states of aware, awakened, enlightened consciousness. And those two different states as having different layers of density. And I do think that the ego can be surmised as existing within a dense state of consciousness. And yet, the ego and the egocentric being is a being just as everybody else is. We are all equally valuable on a level. And I think maybe now what we're stepping into is this time where there is an evolution in that state of consciousness and moving through from the old world into a different way of doing things. We can perhaps see the ego as a representation of the shadow within our collective, the shadow within the consensus reality that we're existing within, which is the shadow as being the elements that things don't want to see, you know, elements that don't want to be dealt with. So when we look at the ego as a part of the moving mechanism of a larger system, this can really help us understand what's going on. It can help us deal and integrate with these toxic relationships because it removes some of the heavy burden of responsibility directly on the individual and just allows us to maneuver our conceptual awareness around that person instead of getting stuck onto them or latched into them. We want to be able to untether and we want to be able to move. And in order to do that, we have to be able to forgive to a certain extent. And I certainly consider that forgiveness is an awful lot about understanding. If you can understand that a toxic person doesn't have the skills, tools, or any capacity to be anything but a toxic person, that conceptual, intellectual awareness allows you to move out from them a little bit. And that's why an awful lot of the development of consciousness from dense states of consciousness into lighter states of consciousness comes about through the integration of consciousness. You know, this is a concept that we integrate and we allow to filter through our system. This is how we heal. We heal because we stop latching onto things and we stop needing them to be so specific. So much of getting through the ego dynamics or toxic relationships, this is an internal healing that's going on. You're reprogramming, you're rewiring your system, you're remapping your brain. You are reformulating how you see the world and how the world works for you. And it is a healing because it's holing. It's bringing you back into wholeness, W-H-O-L-E. You're coming back into your sovereignty and into yourself. You're not relying on a narrative to be a certain way or a person to be a certain character within that narrative. You know, you do you and you allow people to be themselves. One of the final comments that I would like to make about ego just at this time is that I think the ego is the inversion of the sacral chakra. But our sacral chakra is all about connection. It's about connection with ourselves, with others. It's about nurturing. It's very feminine quality and element. It's all about creation, creativity. You know, I think the ego is fundamentally a sacral chakra issue, and it's a collective issue where we as individuals haven't been able to attune or bridge into our sacral chakra very effectively. And that mightn't seem very relevant for somebody such as myself who's in my 30s. But if you look at the older generations, if you look at people who are 50, 60, 70 right now, they grew up in very different times. Their training in the world and their conditioning structure was very, very different. And it's very unfair to expect that other people from older generations would have the same tune in to this sort of stuff as the younger generations do. I heard a comment recently enough, which was to say that there are 4 or 5 different eras of humanity going on concurrently at this time. You know, you have the boomers, you have Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z, Generation Alpha. These are all very different people. We have very different perspectives. So the interweave of what's going on and how we can flow within that interweave is very complex and very difficult. So this is just offering a couple of tidbits of information to join the dots so that you can offer some semblance of solution to encapsulating the concept and problem with ego. Like at the start of the series, we really walked through it on a piece by piece basis. We broke down what they are, how they operate, how that affects. But then the other element is that we need to live with this. And in order to be able to live with it, we have to be able to integrate it and align with ourselves within that structure. So I hope you found this useful. Please do let me know. Please do get in touch. Let me know if there's anything that you would like to be highlighted and all of those sorts of things. I have really enjoyed being with you today. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you guys again.